I'll never forget the sound of my name echoing across the construction site at Lone Star Construction that Thursday morning. The autumn air carried that sharp bite you get in Texas when October decides to remind you winter's coming, and we were 3 weeks deep into a major commercial project downtown Austin. The sound of hammers on steel, the growl of diesel engines, the steady rhythm of men who'd been working together long enough to move like parts of the same machine. "Brady Coleman, you've been served." I looked up from the structural blueprint I was reviewing, my coffee still steaming in a paper cup that had seen better days. Every hard hat on the crew slowly turned toward me like sunflowers following the light, except this light was the kind that burns. Standing there in a suit that cost more than most of my guys made in a week was my wife's attorney, Preston Hayes. His Italian leather shoes were already collecting the fine concrete dust that settles on everything at a job site, and his silk tie looked absurdly out of place among the steel beams, safety equipment, and honest sweat that defined my world. The crew knew something was different. In 15 years of running construction sites, I'd earned their respect the hard way. I showed up first, left last, and never asked them to do anything I wouldn't do myself. When Martinez nearly lost 3 fingers to a saw last spring, I was the one who drove him to the emergency room and sat with his wife until the doctors said he'd keep the hand. When Johnson's kid needed surgery and the insurance was dragging their feet, I made some calls and got things moving. These men had seen me handle union reps, city inspectors, and corporate executives with the same steady calm. But this was different. This was personal, and they could smell it. Preston Hayes held a manila envelope like it contained the 10 Commandments or a death sentence. He didn't wait for me to walk over, didn't show the courtesy of privacy that any decent human being would offer in a situation like this. Instead, he strode straight through the sawdust and scattered tools, his polished shoes clicking against the plywood walkways we'd laid down to keep the mud manageable, right up to my work trailer where I conducted the daily business of keeping 23 men employed and $1 million project on schedule. "Rachel's petition is final," he said, with that practiced smirk that told me he'd done this dance before, probably enjoyed it. "She gets the house, the accounts, and full custody of the kids." His voice carried just loud enough for the nearest workers to hear, which I knew wasn't an accident. Everything about this moment had been calculated to cause maximum damage to my reputation, my authority, and my standing among the men I supervised. Around us, the entire construction site fell into an eerie silence. The rhythmic pounding of hammers stopped mid-swing. The whir of circular saws faded to nothing. The rumble of diesel engines seemed to hold their breath. Even the concrete mixer, that never-silent beast that had been providing the soundtrack to our morning, seemed to pause in respect for the humiliation unfolding like some twisted soap opera under the Texas sun. You could have heard a nail drop in the next county, and I felt the weight of 23 pairs of eyes watching this ambush unfold. But Preston wasn't finished. He had more poison to deliver, more carefully chosen words designed to cut deep into a man's pride in front of his crew. He lowered his voice, not out of kindness or professional courtesy, but to twist the knife deeper, to make this personal wound cut all the way to the bone where it would fester and remind me of this moment every time I looked at these men. "She also wanted me to relay a message," he continued, his smile widening like a shark that had caught the scent of blood in the water. "The kids don't really consider you family anymore. They're embarrassed by your blue-collar life, Brady. Michelle's applying to colleges now, and she doesn't want to put down construction worker when they ask about her father's profession. She's thinking about using her mother's maiden name instead." Those words hit different than all the legal paperwork and financial maneuvering. The house, the bank accounts, the division of assets, that was all just business. The cold machinery of divorce grinding through the accumulated wealth of 14 years together. But my kids, my Michelle, who used to climb onto my shoulders to see over the crowd at her school's science fair, my Spencer, who still asked me to check under his bed for monsters, even though he was getting too old to admit he was scared of the dark. The 2 people I'd worked double shifts for, missed fishing trips for, saved every penny for, so they could have college funds and opportunities I never had growing up. That was where Rachel had crossed a line she could never uncross. For a moment, the words didn't land. Not really. They hovered in the air like dust motes caught in the harsh morning sunlight, streaming through the trailer windows, visible and unsettling, but somehow unreal. like watching someone else's life implode in slow motion while you stood there powerless to stop it. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed louder than the machinery around us, and I could taste the bitter metal flavor of adrenaline flooding my system. But I didn't argue. I didn't curse. I didn't raise my voice or lose my composure the way younger men do when their world gets turned upside down by someone in an expensive suit who's never worked an honest day in his life. At 45, you learn that panic is a luxury you can't afford, especially when 23 men are watching to see if their foreman is the kind of man who folds under pressure or stands his ground when things get ugly. Instead, I simply reached into the bottom drawer of my metal desk, moved aside some old safety manuals and a pack of gum I'd been meaning to throw away, lifted out the plain manila envelope I'd placed there the night before, and handed it to him with a hand as steady as the day I learned to operate a 40-ton crane. "Make sure your client gets this," I said. He frowned, suddenly looking less confident, less in control of the narrative he had been spinning. "What is it?" His silk tie seemed to tighten around his neck as he stared at the envelope in his manicured hands. "Just an answer," I replied, already turning back to my blueprints as if the conversation were over, because for me, it was. The sound of my pencil tapping against the metal desk seemed to echo in the unnatural quiet that had settled over the job site like morning fog. Not a soul on the site spoke as he walked out, his expensive shoes picking their way carefully through the construction debris like he was navigating a minefield. The sound of his car engine starting seemed to break some kind of spell, and gradually, the normal sounds of construction work resumed. Hammers found their rhythm again, saws buzzed back to life, and diesel engines rumbled their familiar songs. But everyone was watching me differently now. They'd seen something they didn't quite understand, but they recognized the look of a man who wasn't going down without a fight. That was the moment everything truly began. Not the divorce papers, not the lawyer's smirk, not even the cruel message about my children. It was the moment I handed over that envelope, containing 15 months of careful investigation, documentation, and preparation for a day I'd hoped would never come. You don't reach 45 years old working construction without learning a few things about people, how they change gradually, like concrete curing, until one day you realize the person sleeping next to you has become someone you barely recognize. How they hide things, thinking they're being clever when really they're just being sloppy. How they justify terrible actions to themselves with elaborate mental gymnastics that would impress Olympic athletes. And I had learned one thing in particular over the years. When someone wants to erase you from your own life, they usually assume you'll just stand still and let them do it. They count on your decency, your desire to avoid conflict, your natural inclination to believe the best about the people you love. They mistake kindness for weakness and patience for stupidity. Rachel had once been the girl who worked at the Austin Public Library's Pflugerville branch, the girl with quiet eyes and a soft voice who believed in small joys and simple pleasures. Sunday morning pancakes with real maple syrup, not the corn syrup substitute. Saving loose change in a coffee can for our someday retirement. Volunteering at our daughter's school carnival, running the ring toss booth with genuine enthusiasm for children's laughter. She used to leave little notes in my lunchbox, stupid jokes or reminders about dinner, plans or just "I love you" written in her careful handwriting. Somewhere along the way, she drifted. Or maybe she'd always been drifting, caught in some current I was too focused on work and bills and raising kids to notice. The library job became part-time, then stopped altogether when she said she needed to focus on the children. The Sunday pancakes became frozen waffles, then skipped breakfast entirely. The notes in my lunchbox disappeared, replaced by empty silence that grew heavier with each passing month. Either way, by the time she sent her attorney to ambush me at work, she'd transformed into someone I barely recognized. Sharper, colder, always calculating angles and advantages. We'd lived under the same roof for 14 years, but the love had evaporated somewhere along the way, leaving behind something stale and bitter like coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. I started noticing the little shifts around year 10 of our marriage. Secretive phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. Unexplained expenses that didn't match the receipts she showed me. Long evenings out under the excuse of helping her mother with household projects. But she never came home with paint under her fingernails or the satisfied tiredness that comes from real work. Nothing dramatic at first. Nothing you could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." just an accumulation of tiny betrayals and half-truths that add up the way rust slowly eats through steel, invisible at first, but eventually weakening the entire structure until one day you realize the beam won't hold the load anymore. But it was the money that told the real story, because numbers don't lie the way people do. I've been managing construction budgets for over 15 years, tracking thousands of dollars in materials, labor, and equipment costs. You get good at noticing when numbers don't add up, when invoices don't match purchase orders, when someone's trying to hide expenses or inflate costs. Rachel was sloppy with her deception, careless in the way that people get when they assume no one is paying attention. A couple of missing bank statements that she claimed must have been lost in the mail, a credit card bill that showed restaurants and shopping trips on days she said she'd been home cleaning the house, a wire transfer made at 2:17 in the morning to her Uncle Wesley's construction business, an uncle she claimed she hadn't spoken to in years because of some family dispute over their father's will. I didn't confront her about any of it. I didn't accuse or demand explanations or stage dramatic confrontations like you see in movies. Instead, I learned. I asked questions silently, researched answers carefully, and waited patiently for the full picture to emerge. Construction taught me that you don't start swinging a hammer until you've studied the blueprints, measured twice, and understood exactly what you're trying to build. And I waited. Patience is something you develop after years of coordinating subcontractors, managing delivery schedules, and dealing with city inspectors who move at the speed of bureaucracy. You learn that rushing usually creates more problems than it solves, and that the right moment to act is often much later than your emotions want it to be. One Saturday about a year ago, the right moment finally arrived in the most unexpected way. I found a box in my late father-in-law's old workshop behind Susan's house. I'd been helping Rachel's mother clear out some equipment that had been gathering dust since Harold passed away 3 years earlier. The man had been a meticulous electrician who kept every receipt, warranty card, and instruction manual he'd ever touched, organized in filing cabinets that would have made an accountant weep with joy. It was one of those perfect September afternoons when the Texas heat finally breaks, and you remember why people choose to live here. The kind of day when the sky looks like it's been washed clean, and the air smells like possibility instead of humidity. Susan had called that morning asking if I could help her sort through Harold's things because she was finally ready to donate his tools to the local trade school. He would have liked that, she said over the phone, her voice still carrying the weight of grief that settles on people like dust after a long absence. Harold always said the best way to honor a craftsman is to pass his tools on to the next generation. While lifting a set of dusty storage bins from the top shelf of Harold's meticulously organized workspace, I noticed one box that seemed heavier than it should have been. The label read, "Electrical supplies, misc wire, and fittings," in Harold's careful block lettering. But when I shifted it, something inside moved with the solid weight of paper, rather than the metallic rattle you'd expect from electrical components. Inside, beneath a thin layer of old work gloves that still smelled faintly of Harold's cigarettes, lay a thick stack of documents rubber banded together like evidence in a crime drama. I might have put them aside without a second thought, assuming they were old warranty information or installation manuals, if not for the letterhead on the top sheet that caught my eye like a warning sign. An attorney's office in Dallas, dated 12 years earlier, with the kind of official seal and formal language that makes your stomach drop before your brain has time to process what you're reading. The words "Conditional Non-Prosecution Agreement" were printed in bold letters across the top, and below that, signatures I recognized immediately. Rachel's careful cursive, Susan's more practical print, and Wesley Martinez's aggressive scrawl that looked like he was angry at the paper. My hands grew cold despite the warm afternoon air. I sat down on the concrete floor of Harold's workshop, surrounded by the tools and memories of a man who'd built his reputation on honest work and straight lines, and read through documents that revealed a family secret that went back 12 years. Within minutes, it became crystal clear that someone in Rachel's family had been involved in a significant financial misconduct case years before I ever noticed any cracks in our marriage. This wasn't some minor tax dispute or accounting error. Based on the legal language and the detailed accusations outlined in page after page of depositions and settlement agreements, they had been caught up in a scheme involving fraudulent insurance claims, falsified inspection reports, and money laundering through Wesley's construction business. And based on the signatures, the dates, and the detailed testimony transcribed in the documents, Rachel, Susan, and Wesley weren't passive witnesses dragged into someone else's mess. They were active participants who'd provided false statements, concealed evidence, and helped move money through a network of shell companies designed to hide the trail from investigators. I forced myself to stay steady, to read through every page with the same methodical attention I brought to reviewing blueprints or checking load calculations. Years in construction teach you that panic clouds judgment, and clouded judgment gets people hurt. On a job site, one moment of lost composure can mean the difference between going home to your family at the end of the day or going home in a body bag. The deeper I read, the worse it got. Rachel had signed documents swearing that certain inspection reports were legitimate when the investigators had already proven they were fabricated. Susan had provided sworn testimony, claiming she had no knowledge of financial irregularities in Wesley's business, while bank records showed regular transfers from her accounts to his shell companies. Wesley had claimed that damaged properties were the result of accidents when evidence suggested the damage had been deliberately caused to trigger insurance payouts. The conditional non-prosecution agreement meant that charges had been dropped in exchange for restitution, cooperation, and a promise that none of the parties would engage in similar activities in the future. But it also meant that if any of them violated the terms of the agreement, or if new evidence emerged, the entire case could be reopened with devastating consequences. I didn't remove the original documents from Harold's workshop. I'm not the kind of man who steals, even when the theft might be justified by circumstances. But I carefully photographed every page with my phone, noting the case numbers, the names of the investigating officers, and the contact information for the attorneys who'd negotiated the settlement. That evening, after Susan had thanked me for my help and I'd loaded Harold's donated tools into my truck, I drove straight to the courthouse and requested copies of the public records associated with the case. In Texas, financial misconduct. Investigations leave paper trails that last for decades, especially when they involve federal insurance fraud. And I knew exactly where to look. When the mailed copies arrived a week later, thick manila envelopes with official county seals and that distinctive smell of government paperwork, I took them straight to my old friend, Russell Brooks. Russell had practiced law for 30 years before retiring to spend his days fishing the Red River and playing dominoes at the VFW. He reads legal text the way most men read sports scores, with the kind of practiced eye that comes from decades of courtroom experience. I found him at his usual spot on the riverbank, a quiet bend where the water runs deep and the catfish hide in the shadows of overhanging cypress trees. "Russell," I said, settling down on the grassy bank beside him, watching his fishing line disappear into the dark water. "I need you to look at something, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's not what I want to hear." He set down his fishing rod and adjusted his reading glasses, the kind with thick lenses that had seen decades of legal briefs and contract negotiations. "That sounds serious, Brady. What kind of trouble are we talking about?" I handed him the thick folder of documents, watching his weathered face as he began to read. Russell had the kind of methodical approach to legal text that came from years of representing working-class people who couldn't afford mistakes. Oil field workers injured on the job, construction crews dealing with safety violations, families fighting insurance companies that tried to deny legitimate claims. He'd seen every kind of corporate malfeasance and legal maneuvering that people use to take advantage of honest folks. For the next hour, we sat in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional grunt or low whistle from Russell as he worked through the evidence. The sun was setting behind the cypress trees by the time he finally set the documents down, folded his hands, and looked at me with the kind of expression you see on a doctor's face when the test results are worse than expected. "Brady," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades spent in courtrooms where people's lives hung in the balance. "This is worse than you think. Much worse. If this case ever gets reopened, if a prosecutor decides to take another look at these conditional agreements, your wife and her family aren't just looking at financial penalties. We're talking about federal fraud charges, conspiracy, money laundering through interstate commerce. Prison time, son. Real prison time." He picked up one of the documents and pointed to a specific section highlighted in yellow. "See this clause here? The non-prosecution agreement is conditional on continued good behavior and full disclosure of all assets and activities. If they've been hiding money, if they've engaged in any similar activities, if they've violated any aspect of this agreement, the whole thing becomes null and void. And based on what I'm seeing in these bank records you've collected, there are some very suspicious patterns that suggest ongoing financial irregularities. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What kind of patterns? Regular transfers to offshore accounts, shell company formations that serve no legitimate business purpose, real estate transactions that don't make economic sense unless you're trying to launder money or hide assets from creditors. Your wife's Uncle Wesley has been very busy since this case was supposedly closed. Russell handed the documents back to me with a shake of his head. Brady, I've been practicing law for long enough to recognize when someone's walking on thin ice. Your wife's family isn't just vulnerable to having this case reopened. Based on what I'm seeing here, they should be genuinely terrified that someone's going to notice what they've been up to. I thanked him with a handshake and a promise to keep him updated on whatever developed. The drive home gave me time to think about what I'd learned and what it meant for my marriage, my children, and the life I'd spent 14 years building with Rachel. I went home to my quiet house where Rachel was reading a magazine in the living room and the kids were doing homework at the kitchen table. Everything looked so normal on the surface, like a photograph of domestic tranquility. Michelle hunched over her algebra textbook with the same intense concentration she brought to everything she cared about. Spencer practicing his cursive writing, tongue poking out slightly in concentration, the way he'd done since he was 5 years old. I tucked the legal documents into a manila envelope, sealed it carefully, and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk at work. And then I waited, hoping against hope that I'd never need to use what I'd discovered. For months I watched and listened, looking for signs that Rachel might be ready to have an honest conversation about whatever trouble her family had gotten themselves into. I hoped that we could find a way to work through the deception, to rebuild trust, to protect our children from the consequences of decisions made years before they were born. But instead of confession or reconciliation, I got lawyers and legal ambushes. Instead of honest conversation, I got calculated humiliation, designed to strip away everything I'd worked for. Instead of protecting our children, Rachel decided to use them as weapons, telling them their father wasn't good enough, wasn't successful enough, wasn't worthy of their respect or love. I'd hoped, truly hoped with every fiber of my being that I'd never need those documents. But one thing you learn after 45 years on this earth is that life has a way of testing the things you try hardest to protect. 14 years of marriage, 2 children who meant everything to me, a house built on sweat, patience, and countless Saturday mornings spent on projects that made our place feel like home. I would have worked through anything with Rachel. Financial problems, family drama, career changes, health scares, all the challenges that test every marriage over time. Anything except deliberate, calculated deception that turned my own children into weapons against me and tried to destroy my reputation among the men who depended on me for their livelihoods. So, when Preston Hayes swaggered onto my job site that Thursday morning, smirk carved deep into his face like a scar, and declared that Rachel would take the house, the money, and both kids while humiliating me in front of my crew, I wasn't blindsided. I was prepared. The envelope I gave him wasn't a threat or an ultimatum or a bluff. It was simply the truth, carefully documented and legally verified over 15 months of patient investigation. And deep down, I think Rachel and her family always feared the day someone would find it. That day had arrived, and from the moment they opened that letter, the quiet unraveling of 12 years began, one trembling phone call at a time. I didn't check my phone the rest of that day, didn't call Rachel to warn her, didn't give anyone a heads up about what was coming. I finished reviewing the blueprints for the foundation work we'd be starting Monday, checked in with the concrete crew about their delivery schedule, and made sure the safety equipment was properly maintained and accounted for. Just another Thursday on the job, except for the envelope that had changed everything. But at 6:45 that evening, as I pulled my F-150 into the driveway of our modest ranch house in Pflugerville, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. One missed call from Susan, then another, then 6 more in rapid succession. The number kept climbing as I sat in my truck, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, and watching the familiar lights of my neighborhood flicker on against the gathering darkness. By the time the sun had dipped behind the live oak trees that lined our street, I had 14 missed calls from Susan, 7 from Wesley, and a handful of unknown numbers that I figured were other family members who'd been brought into whatever crisis meeting was happening on the other side of town. They had opened the envelope, and the carefully buried secret that started 12 years ago was finally coming home to roost. I walked into my house and set my keys on the kitchen counter, the same counter where Rachel used to leave me notes about grocery lists and dinner plans and little reminders that made a house feel like a home. The silence felt different now, heavier somehow, like the air before a thunderstorm when you can feel the electricity building in the atmosphere. My phone buzzed constantly, but I ignored it. I heated up a bowl of leftover chili, sat at the kitchen table where my family used to eat dinner together, and ate slowly while I thought about what would happen next. When you're 45 years old and you've seen enough of life to understand how these situations play out, you learn to let the moment settle before you decide what to do with it. Around 8:30 that night, as I sat on the back porch with a cold beer in my hands, listening to the familiar sounds of suburban evenings settling around me, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. "Brady?" Susan's voice trembled with fear and desperation. "Please, we need to talk. Please." "I'm here," I said calmly, watching a neighbor walk his dog under the streetlights. "You saw those papers. You knew about this whole time." She wasn't angry or defensive. She sounded like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss she never wanted to face. "I did," I said, "for over a year." "Oh, God." She broke into deep, racking sobs that carried the weight of 12 years of secrets finally coming to light. "Brady, you have to understand. We were pressured by the attorneys. The investigators were threatening everything we'd worked for. We thought it was the only way to keep the family together, to protect Wesley from going to prison." "And now?" I asked. "If this comes out, if the court sees any of those documents, Brady, we're all finished. Not just Wesley, all of us. Rachel doesn't even know how deep the consequences go if this case gets reopened." I let out a slow breath, watching the lights from passing cars reflect off the wet pavement, where an evening shower had left everything clean and shining. She should have thought about that before she tried to take my children from me. Susan cried softly, the sound of a woman who finally understood the gravity of what they'd started. "Please, let's talk in person tomorrow morning. Please, there has to be a way to work this out." I didn't promise anything. I didn't threaten anything either. I simply said, "We'll see." The next morning brought exactly the kind of conversation I'd expected. Rachel and Susan showed up at my door at 7:30 a.m., both looking like they'd aged 5 years overnight. The confident woman who'd sent a lawyer to humiliate me was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that actions have consequences. We talked on my front porch for nearly an hour, not as enemies trying to destroy each other, but as two people who'd shared 14 years of life together and needed to find a way forward that protected our children from the worst of what their mother's family had done. By the end of that conversation, the aggressive divorce petition was withdrawn. The demands for the house, the savings, and full custody disappeared like morning fog. We worked out a fair settlement that acknowledged both of our contributions to the marriage and ensured that Michelle and Spencer would have two parents who could coexist peacefully for their sake. The documents that had started this whole mess went into my backyard fire pit that same weekend. Some secrets serve a purpose when they're needed, but once justice is done, they only serve the past, and I was ready to build a future worth living. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized with handshakes instead of courtroom drama. Rachel kept her part-time job at a bookstore and moved into a small apartment across town. The kids split their time between us, and while it wasn't the family I'd originally planned for, it was honest in a way our marriage hadn't been for years. To the men listening to this story, especially those who found themselves in similar situations, remember this: sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the loudest truth. When someone tries to strip away everything you've built through honest work and dedication, sometimes that truth is the only weapon you need, not revenge, not cruelty, just truth, delivered at exactly the right moment, and sometimes that's enough.